They erased me at 16 with a notarized document and told the world I no longer existed. And 20 years later, they showed up at my door offering me $250,000 to pretend I had a son. They had already promised to 200 guests at their anniversary gala. But what they didn't know was that the story they built to protect their reputation was about to collapse the moment I walked into that room. My name is Elena Brooks. I'm 35 years old, and I grew up in a family where appearances mattered more than anything else, where every decision was measured against how it would look to other people, how it would reflect on our name, and how it would fit into the version of ourselves that my parents worked carefully to present to the world. And from the outside, we looked exactly the way they wanted: stable, successful, and controlled. But inside that structure, roles were assigned early, and mine was defined in a way that never really changed. I was the one who didn't fit the image, the one who complicated things, the one they quietly adjusted around instead of including. They never said it directly, not in those words, but it showed up in smaller ways that were easy to overlook at first. Family photos where everyone else was called in while I was told to just stand over there for a second. Pictures that were later framed and displayed without me in them. Moments that seemed insignificant on their own, but formed a pattern over time. One where my absence became normal, something that didn't need explanation because it had already been accepted. At school events or family gatherings, the same pattern repeated itself. My achievements were acknowledged briefly, if at all, often redirected into conversations about someone else. My siblings, their accomplishments, their plans, their future. While mine were treated as temporary or less important, something that didn't need the same level of attention or investment. And when I tried to share something I was proud of, the response was usually measured, polite, but distant, as if it didn't quite belong in the narrative they were building. I learned to adjust to that without realizing it at the time, to lower expectations, to keep things to myself, to stop looking for recognition in places where it wasn't going to come. And over time, that adjustment became part of how I saw myself, not as someone who deserved to be included, but as someone who needed to stay out of the way so everything else could remain intact. And the more I adapted to that role, the easier it became for everyone else to continue treating it as fixed. There were moments when the difference was more visible, when decisions were made that clearly placed me outside the center of the family. But even then, the explanation was always the same. It was about what was best, what was necessary, what made sense for the situation, and those explanations were presented in a way that didn't invite disagreement, because they were framed as practical, not personal, as if my exclusion was simply a matter of logic rather than choice. Over time, I stopped questioning it, not because I agreed with it, but because it was easier to move within a system that didn't change than to challenge something that had already been decided. And that's how the role of the mistake took shape. Not through one defining moment, but through a series of small decisions that added up. Decisions that placed me just outside the version of the family that was shown to everyone else. Decisions that made it clear, without ever needing to say it directly, that I wasn't part of what they were trying to preserve. I was 16 when everything shifted from something unspoken into something final, and it happened faster than I had time to understand. One conversation turning into a decision that had clearly been made before I was ever included in it. And when I told them I was pregnant, the reaction wasn't confusion or concern. It was immediate, controlled, and structured in a way that made it clear this wasn't a situation they intended to work through. It was something they intended to remove. My father didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply outlined what would happen next, as if he were presenting terms rather than responding to his daughter. And within hours, the house that had always felt carefully managed became something else entirely. A place where I no longer had a defined role, no space, no position, just a problem that needed to be handled quickly and completely. And my mother, who had always been focused on how things looked, didn't ask questions about what I needed or what I planned to do. She focused on what this meant for them, how it would affect the image they had spent years building. The decision came that same day. I wasn't going to stay. There was no discussion about options, no attempt to find a solution that included me, only a clear separation, and what made it different from everything that had come before was how formal it became. Because this wasn't just a conversation, it was documented, turned into something official, something that could be enforced and referenced later, and by the next morning, I received an email. It wasn't long, it wasn't emotional. It contained a notarized document outlining the termination of any financial responsibility, any inheritance, any legal connection that extended beyond what could not be immediately removed. And as I read through it, line by line, the meaning settled in a way that felt distant at first, like I was looking at something that didn't fully connect to me, because this wasn't how families handled conflict. This was how transactions were closed. There was no ambiguity in it, no room for interpretation. It didn't ask for agreement. It stated a condition. And in that moment, everything that had once been implied about my place in the family became explicit. I wasn't just outside the image anymore. I was removed from the structure entirely, not through distance or silence, but through documentation that treated the relationship as something that could be ended with a signature. My mother was the one who said it out loud later that evening, not in anger, not in a raised voice, but in a tone that was controlled and final. "You are dead to this family," she said, standing in the doorway as if she were marking the boundary between what had been and what would come next. And the words didn't feel dramatic in the moment. They felt procedural, just like the closing line of something that had already been decided. It was raining when I left. Not lightly, not something that could be ignored, but steady enough to make everything feel heavier, slower. And I stood outside with a single suitcase, the door closing behind me without hesitation, without a pause, without anyone stepping out to reconsider what had just happened. And for a few seconds, I didn't move. Not because I didn't know where to go, but because I was trying to understand how something that had been part of my life for 16 years could end so completely in a single day. Eventually, I walked, not toward anything specific, just away from what was no longer mine, carrying everything I had in one hand, with nothing behind me that I could return to. And even then, standing in the rain with nowhere to go. Yet I thought that was the worst part. But that wasn't even the worst part. In the weeks after I left, the silence from my family didn't feel like an absence. It felt deliberate, structured in a way that suggested something was being managed behind the scenes. And at first, I didn't understand what that meant. I was focused on surviving, finding somewhere to stay, figuring out how to move forward without anything I had known before. But eventually, pieces of information started to reach me, not directly, but through people who had known us, conversations that carried a version of events I hadn't been part of. They told people I had gone abroad, not temporarily, not under difficult circumstances, but as a choice, something planned, something that aligned with a narrative that made sense within the image they had always maintained. And the way it was presented removed any sense of disruption, any indication that something had gone wrong. It turned my absence into something clean, something easy to accept. And because it was consistent with everything they had built before, no one questioned it. Over time, that version of the story became the only one that existed in their world. My name stopped appearing in conversations. My presence was removed from photos, from records, from anything that suggested I had been part of the family in a meaningful way, and what replaced it wasn't just silence. It was a constructed version of reality that filled the space I had left, one where everything continued without interruption, without complication, without me. I learned about it slowly, piece by piece, through fragments that didn't seem connected at first. Someone mentioning that my family had said I was studying overseas, another person referring to plans I was supposedly pursuing in another country, and each time I heard it, it felt less like a misunderstanding and more like a system, something that had been designed to keep their image intact without leaving gaps that others might notice. But the part that changed everything came later. Years later. Long after I had stopped expecting anything from them. Long after I had built enough distance that their version of events no longer defined my day-to-day life. I heard something that didn't just replace me. It rewrote me entirely. They had started talking about a grandson, not in vague terms, not as a possibility, but as a person who existed. Someone they described with detail, with pride, and with the kind of specificity that made it sound real. A prodigy, successful, accomplished, someone who reflected everything they valued. At first, I thought it was a misunderstanding, a confusion with someone else in the extended family, but the more I listened, the clearer it became. This wasn't a mistake. It was intentional, a new narrative layered on top of the old one, designed to not only replace my absence, but to improve on it, to create a version of the future that fit perfectly into the image they had always wanted. They didn't just erase me, they replaced me with something better. And the most unsettling part wasn't that they had done it. It was how easily it was accepted, how naturally it fit into the story they had been telling for years, how no one questioned where this grandson had come from. Because in a system built on appearance, if something looked right, it didn't need to be proven. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about being excluded. It was about being rewritten. And once something is rewritten that completely, it stops being an absence. It becomes something else entirely. It had been 20 years since the last time I saw them. Long enough for the past to settle into something distant. Something I didn't revisit unless I had to. And by then, my life had structure, routine, people who knew me for who I was rather than who I had been labeled to be. And because of that distance, I didn't expect them to return. Not suddenly, not without warning, not in a way that would place them directly back into my space. But they did. They arrived without announcement, standing at my door as if the years between us had been a pause rather than a separation, dressed the same way they always had, controlled, composed, carrying themselves with the same certainty that had defined every decision they had made before. And for a moment, I didn't react. Not because I didn't recognize them, but because I was trying to understand what could possibly bring them back after everything that had happened. They didn't start with an apology. They didn't acknowledge the past. They moved straight to the reason they were there. My father spoke first, outlining the situation in the same measured tone he had used years ago, explaining that they were hosting a major event, a 50th anniversary celebration, a formal gathering with hundreds of guests, and that there was a complication. Something that needed to be resolved quickly and discreetly, and as he spoke, I could feel the pattern returning, not in what he said, but in how he said it. The assumption that this was something I would step into without question. Then the offer came. $250,000. A check, already prepared. Placed on the table between us as if it were the center of the conversation. And alongside it, something else. A promise that extended beyond the immediate moment. A share of the estate, $3.5 million, framed not as compensation, but as inclusion. as if the past could be adjusted through numbers, as if value could be reassigned in a way that made everything else irrelevant. The condition was simple: 3 hours, attend the event, play the role they had created, a complete family, a grandson included. And as those words settled, the realization followed immediately, not slowly, not with hesitation, but clearly, completely. They hadn't come back because they had changed. They had come back because they needed something, and the way they approached it, the structure, the offer, the absence of acknowledgement, made that undeniable. For a moment, I didn't respond. Not because I didn't understand what they were asking, but because I was deciding how much of the past needed to be spoken in order to answer it. And before I could say anything, my mother added something else, her tone quieter, but more direct, explaining that this wasn't optional in the way I might think, that the situation had already been built around expectations, that people would ask questions. That there were ways to resolve this easily or ways that could become more complicated. And then she said it, not as a threat, but as a possibility, that they could reach out on their own, that if necessary, they could find my child, speak to them, explain things in a way that aligned with the narrative they had already created. That sentence changed the weight of everything in the room. Because until that moment, the offer had been about them, their event, their reputation. But with that single statement, it extended into something else, something that crossed a line I had already drawn years ago, and the clarity that followed wasn't emotional. It wasn't reactive. It was precise. They hadn't changed. Not in how they saw me, not in how they handled conflict, not in what they were willing to do to maintain control over their image. And whatever decision I made next, it wasn't going to be based on what they were offering. It was going to be based on what they had just shown me. Again, without hesitation, without reflection, exactly who they still were. The years after I left didn't unfold in a straight line. They moved in fragments, in small decisions made day by day, because there was no structure waiting for me, no plan I could follow, just a series of choices that had to be made with whatever I had at the time, and in the beginning, that wasn't much. I worked wherever I could. Early mornings, late nights, jobs that didn't connect to each other except for one thing. They kept me moving forward. They covered what needed to be covered, and they gave me enough stability to focus on what mattered beyond survival. Money was always tight, not in a dramatic way, but in a constant, steady pressure that shaped every decision, every expense, every risk I considered taking. And there were times when it felt like I was only a few steps ahead of falling back. But I kept going. Not because I was certain it would lead somewhere, but because stopping didn't feel like an option. There was a point when things began to feel different. Not easier, but more defined. I met someone who saw me without needing an explanation. Someone who didn't ask about where I came from or why I was on my own. Just accepted what was in front of them and built from there. And for a while, that gave me something I hadn't had before. A sense that life could be stable in a way that wasn't dependent on the past, that I could build something that felt complete. Then that changed. The accident happened without warning. The kind of moment that doesn't give you time to prepare or understand. It just removes something from your life and leaves you standing in the space where it used to be. And after that, everything shifted again, not back to where I started, but into something else, something quieter, heavier, where the future I had begun to imagine no longer existed in the same way. I was alone again, but not in the same way as before, because this time I wasn't just responsible for myself, I had a child. And that changed the meaning of everything. Every decision, every risk, every step forward had to account for more than just my own survival. And that responsibility didn't make things easier, but it made them clearer. It removed hesitation. It narrowed focus. And in that clarity, I started to think differently about what I was building. Not just something that worked day to day, but something that could grow, something that could support more than the present moment. That's where the idea of building a business came in. Not as a plan from the beginning, but as something that developed from what I was already doing, skills I had picked up along the way, patterns I had noticed, opportunities that didn't require permission to pursue. And I started small, testing ideas, taking on work that others overlooked, learning through trial rather than instruction. And slowly, something began to take shape. Not quickly, not in a way that felt secure at first, but steadily enough to continue. The hardest part wasn't starting. It was being taken seriously. Banks didn't see what I saw. Loan applications were reviewed and rejected, not because the idea didn't make sense, but because I didn't fit the profile they expected. No traditional background, no safety net, no history that aligned with their criteria, and each rejection added to the same message, that what I was trying to build wasn't considered stable enough. Not yet. There were moments when everything felt like it was narrowing again, when the effort I was putting in didn't seem to match the results, when the gap between where I was and where I needed to be felt too wide to close. And in those moments, it was easy to question everything, not just the path, but the decision to take it at all. I thought everything was over, not in a dramatic sense, but in a quiet realization that the version of the future I had been working toward might not be reachable, that I might have lost too much, too early, to build something that could hold long term. And that thought stayed with me longer than I expected, shaping how I saw each next step. At one point, I reached out for guidance, not expecting a solution, just a perspective from someone who had built something similar. And when I presented what I had, the response was direct, not dismissive, but clear. "You're not ready," they said, explaining that what I had was a start, not a foundation, that there were gaps I hadn't accounted for, risks I hadn't fully understood. And while part of me resisted hearing that, another part recognized it as true. It wasn't a rejection, but it wasn't approval either. And standing there, between what I had built and what I still needed to become, it felt like I was back in the same place I had been before, not moving backward, but not yet moving forward in a way that could sustain itself. That was the point where most people would have stopped, or at least paused long enough to reconsider everything. A few weeks after that conversation, when I had already adjusted my expectations back to working through things on my own, I received a message I wasn't expecting. Not formal, not structured, just a short note asking if I had time to meet again, and for a moment, I hesitated. Not because I didn't want to go, but because I wasn't sure what could come from a second conversation after being told I wasn't ready. But something about the tone felt different, less like evaluation and more like curiosity, and that was enough to say yes. We met in her office early in the morning, before most of the building had filled, the kind of quiet that makes everything feel more focused. And this time, the conversation didn't start with what I was missing. It started with what I had done. She asked me to walk through the decisions I had made so far. Not just the outcomes, but the reasoning behind them, how I had chosen where to spend money, how I had handled setbacks, how I had identified opportunities without external guidance. And as I explained it, step by step, I realized I wasn't just describing actions. I was describing a way of thinking that had developed out of necessity. She listened without interrupting, taking notes occasionally, and when I finished, she didn't go back to the same conclusion as before. She leaned back slightly and reframed what she had seen, not as something incomplete, but as something raw, something that hadn't been refined yet but carried a structure underneath it. She pointed out patterns I hadn't recognized, Decisions that aligned with long-term thinking even when I didn't have the language to describe them, ways I had adapted under pressure that suggested more than just persistence. Then she said something that shifted the conversation entirely. She said that what I lacked in formal readiness, I made up for in instinct, that I had a way of reading situations, adjusting quickly, and continuing forward without waiting for perfect conditions. And that kind of resilience, combined with a developing sense of how to build something from limited resources, wasn't something that could be taught easily. It had to be developed. And I had already done that part. She didn't offer a solution. She offered a test. A small project, limited in scope, something that wouldn't carry major risk for her company, but would require me to apply everything I had been doing in a more structured environment, with real expectations, real timelines, and real consequences if it didn't work. And the way she presented it made one thing clear: this wasn't a favor. It was an opportunity to prove something that couldn't be explained in a conversation. I didn't hesitate. Not because I was confident in the outcome, but because I understood what it represented. A chance to move from potential into something measurable, something that existed beyond my own effort, and into a system where results mattered in a different way. And as I accepted it, I knew this wasn't the kind of opportunity that would change everything immediately. It was smaller than that, more specific, but it was real. And sometimes, that's all you need to change direction. That first project did not transform everything overnight. It was smaller than anything I had imagined when I first thought about building a business, but it forced me into a different level of accountability. Timelines that could not be adjusted, expectations that were not flexible, and decisions that carried consequences beyond my own situation. And in that structure, something began to change, not in how hard I worked, but in how I approached what I was building. I started to think in terms of systems rather than tasks, patterns rather than reactions, and that shift created something more stable than anything I had done before. The project led to another, not because I asked for it, but because the results made sense to the people who were watching, and from there, opportunities expanded slowly, not in large jumps, but in consistent steps that added to each other. I took on freelance work first, managing small contracts, learning how to balance multiple responsibilities without losing focus, and as those projects grew, so did the scope of what I was handling, until the work itself began to require more than just me. That was the point where I made the decision to formalize everything, to build something that could exist beyond individual projects. A small firm at first, structured enough to take on larger clients, flexible enough to adjust as needed. And the transition wasn't easy. It required risks I had avoided before. Hiring people when I wasn't certain I could sustain it long term, committing to costs that didn't have immediate returns. But each decision was made with the same clarity that had guided me from the beginning, not based on what was comfortable, but on what was necessary to move forward. Over time, the structure held. The firm grew. Clients stayed. Revenue increased in a way that wasn't dramatic, but consistent, until it reached a point that felt real, not just sustainable, but stable. $3 million in annual revenue, a team of 15 people who relied on the systems I had built, and for the first time, the work existed independently of my daily involvement. It could function, expand, and adapt, without depending on every decision passing through me. I didn't announce it. I didn't share it widely, because the way I had learned to build things did not rely on recognition. It relied on continuity. And while the business became something larger, something that carried weight in its own space, the version of me that existed in my family's world remained unchanged. There had been no contact, no updates, no attempt to reconnect. And in that absence, they filled the space the same way they always had, with assumptions that aligned with the narrative they had created years ago, that I had left, that I had failed, that whatever path I had taken had led nowhere meaningful, and without information to challenge that belief, it remained intact. They thought I had disappeared. They thought I had become irrelevant. And the most important part was that they had no reason to question it, because everything I had built existed entirely outside the world they understood, outside the systems they valued, outside the image they had spent years protecting. For the first time, that distance worked in my favor. Hot because what I was building did not need to be seen by them to be real. It only needed to continue. The gala was exactly the kind of event my parents had spent their entire lives preparing for. A 50th anniversary celebration held in a luxury hotel ballroom, carefully designed down to the smallest detail, with guests arriving in formal attire, live music set at just the right volume, and cameras positioned to capture every moment for a live stream that extended far beyond the room itself. And from the outside, it looked flawless, a perfect reflection of the image they had built over decades. I arrived without announcing myself, not through the main entrance where guests were being greeted, but through a side corridor that led directly into the ballroom, the kind of entrance that didn't draw attention immediately, but allowed me to step into the space on my own terms. And as I walked in, I took in the room the way I always did, not emotionally, but observationally, noting the structure, the way people moved, the patterns of attention, the positioning of the stage, the cameras, the points where focus would naturally shift once the program began. They hadn't seen me yet, not because I was hiding, but because I wasn't part of the frame they expected. And in a room built around a narrative that had excluded me for years, my presence didn't register right away. It didn't fit into what they had prepared for, and that gave me something I hadn't had before: control over how the moment would unfold. My daughter walked beside me, steady, composed, aware of where we were and why we were there, not as part of their story, but as part of mine. And bringing her into that space wasn't a reaction, it was a decision, something I had considered carefully, because she represented something they had never acknowledged, something they had replaced with a version that didn't exist, and her presence alone shifted the meaning of everything they had built around that absence. As we moved further into the room, a few people began to notice, not recognizing me immediately, but sensing something unfamiliar in a space that was otherwise controlled, and that subtle shift in attention spread slowly. Not enough to interrupt the flow of the event, but enough to create a quiet undercurrent, a recognition that something unexpected had entered the room. On the stage, the program continued as planned, speeches prepared, timelines followed, the structure holding exactly the way it was designed to, and my parents remained at the center of it, confident, composed, speaking to an audience that believed in the version of events they had presented for years. And for a moment, it almost looked like nothing would change, like everything would proceed exactly as they intended. But the difference was already there, not in what had been said, but in what was about to be revealed. Because for the first time, the story they had built was about to intersect with something they hadn't accounted for, something that didn't fit into their narrative, something that existed outside their control. And as I stood there, waiting for the right moment, watching the structure of the evening move toward the point where attention would focus entirely on the stage, I knew exactly when that intersection would happen. They thought they were in control of the story. They thought they had accounted for every detail. They didn't know their biggest lie was about to collapse. When the host invited my parents to the stage for the final segment of the evening, the room shifted into a kind of focused silence, the lights narrowing slightly, cameras adjusting to frame them at the center. And for a moment, everything aligned exactly the way they had planned it. A lifetime of controlled presentation culminating in a single moment that was meant to confirm everything they had built. And I waited until that moment settled completely before I moved. I didn't rush. I walked toward the stage at a steady pace, not interrupting, not forcing attention, but allowing the natural shift to happen as people noticed someone approaching from the side. And when I reached the steps, there was a brief hesitation from the event staff, a pause that lasted just long enough for the room to register that something unexpected was happening. And then I stepped up, crossing into the frame they had prepared without asking for permission. The microphone was still in my father's hand when I reached him, and for a second he didn't react. Not because he didn't recognize me, but because recognition and understanding were happening at the same time, and before he could respond, I reached for the microphone, not forcefully, not abruptly, just enough to take control of the moment, and the room followed that movement immediately, the shift from expectation to attention happening in a way that didn't require explanation. I stood there, looking out at the audience, at the cameras, at the space that had been built to support a story that no longer held, and I didn't raise my voice. I didn't rush the words. I let them come out exactly as they needed to, clear and direct. "There is no grandson," I said. And the effect was immediate, not loud, not chaotic, but complete. The kind of silence that removes everything else from the room, leaving only the meaning of what had just been said. I paused, not for effect, but because the room needed time to process something that contradicted everything it had been told. And then I continued, "You invented him because you erased me." And as those words settled, the structure of the evening began to shift in real time, not collapsing all at once, but losing its alignment piece by piece as the context changed around it. I didn't stop there, because this wasn't just about what I said, it was about what could be proven. I reached into the folder I had brought with me and held up the documents, not dramatically, not as a performance, but as something factual, something that existed independent of the moment. Notarized papers that outlined exactly what had happened 20 years earlier. The legal separation, the removal of responsibility, the signatures that formalized what they had chosen to do, and I handed them to the nearest member of the event staff, who passed them forward, allowing others on stage to review them, the process unfolding in a way that made it visible to everyone watching. A voice from the audience spoke next, not planned, not part of the event, but necessary. A neighbor from years ago, someone who had seen what happened that night, who confirmed it in simple terms, not adding emotion, not exaggerating, just stating what they had witnessed. And that confirmation added another layer, not opinion, not interpretation, but memory that aligned with what was already being shown. The cameras continued to record everything. The live stream didn't pause. There was no edit, no interruption, no way to reshape what was happening into something else, because it was unfolding in real time, in front of both the room and anyone watching beyond it, and that made it permanent in a way that couldn't be undone later. No one argued, no one corrected it, because there was nothing to correct. The documents were clear. The witness was direct. The moment was recorded. And in that alignment, what had been built over years to protect a single narrative became impossible to maintain. It's not because it was challenged emotionally, but because it no longer matched what could be seen, verified, and understood by everyone present. For a few seconds after I finished speaking, no one moved. Not because they didn't know what to do, but because the moment had shifted beyond anything they had prepared for. And in that silence, the contrast between what had been planned and what was actually happening became impossible to ignore. The stage that had been set to reinforce a carefully built image now held something entirely different, something that couldn't be redirected or contained. My father was the first to react, but not in the way anyone would have expected. He didn't step forward. He didn't take back the microphone. He didn't attempt to correct or challenge what had just been said. He simply stood there, his posture rigid, his expression fixed in a way that suggested he was trying to process too many things at once. And for someone who had always controlled every detail, every narrative, every outcome, the absence of control became visible immediately, not through what he did, but through what he couldn't do, which was speak. He opened his mouth once, as if to respond, but no words followed. And that hesitation carried more weight than any argument could have, because it signaled something fundamental, that the structure he relied on to maintain authority was no longer functioning, that the situation had moved beyond his ability to manage it in the way he always had, and in that moment, the control he had carried into the room disappeared without being taken, simply because it no longer applied. My mother reacted differently, not with stillness, but with visible emotion that broke through the composure she had maintained for years, the shift happening quickly, her expression tightening, her breathing uneven, as she tried to respond, not to the audience, but to the moment itself, attempting to reshape what had just been said into something else, something that could still be managed, but each attempt lost its structure as soon as it began, because the narrative she had built depended on consistency. And that consistency had already been broken. Her voice rose briefly, not in anger, but in something closer to urgency, a need to regain control of how the story was being told. But there was no space left for that. Not in the room, not in the context that had already been established. And as the realization settled in, the composure she had relied on gave way to something else entirely, not dramatic, not performative, but a visible collapse of the certainty she had carried for so long. The audience didn't react immediately, not with noise or interruption, but with a kind of collective withdrawal, people stepping back slightly, conversations stopping before they began, attention shifting from engagement to observation, and in that shift, the social structure that had supported my parents began to change, not through confrontation, but through distance, through the quiet recognition that what they had believed no longer aligned with what they had just seen. That shift didn't stay in the room, because the live stream continued, uninterrupted, carrying the same moment beyond the physical space into a wider audience that wasn't bound by the same social context. And as the recording spread, as clips were shared, discussed, and reinterpreted in real time, the consequences extended into areas that had once reinforced their position: institutions, relationships, and networks that depended on trust and consistency. By the following days, the effects became more defined. The church where my father held a leadership role requested a review, not based on accusation, but on the discrepancy between what had been presented publicly and what had now been revealed. And within that structure, the outcome was predictable. Not immediate removal, but a process that led to the same result: distance, suspension, and eventually, absence from a role that depended on credibility. Business relationships followed a similar pattern. Clients who had worked with them for years began to reassess, not reacting emotionally, but practically, evaluating whether the situation affected the stability and reputation they were associated with. And in that evaluation, some chose to step back, to pause contracts, to create distance until clarity returned. And while those decisions were framed as temporary, the effect was the same. The network that had supported their position began to thin. Socially, the change was quieter, but just as significant. People who had once engaged easily became more reserved, Interactions shortened, invitations reduced, not through direct rejection, but through a gradual shift in perception, where the version of reality they had accepted was replaced by something more complex, something that required them to reconsider how they position themselves in relation to it. No single moment caused that collapse. It wasn't one reaction or one decision. It was the accumulation of clarity, of information that aligned in a way that couldn't be ignored, and once that alignment existed, everything built on the previous narrative had to adjust, not dramatically, but inevitably, because systems that depend on perception cannot hold when that perception changes at the foundation. After the room began to settle and the event moved into a kind of quiet aftermath, I stepped away from the center of the stage, not in a rush, not trying to escape the moment, but allowing it to complete itself without forcing anything further. And it didn't take long for them to approach, not with the same confidence they had carried earlier, but with something more uncertain, something that reflected the shift that had already taken place. My father stood in front of me, closer now than he had been in years, but without the authority that had always defined his presence, his posture less rigid, his voice lower, as if he were trying to find a way back into a conversation that no longer followed the structure he understood, and my mother remained just behind him, not speaking immediately, her expression still unsettled, the composure she once relied on replaced by something quieter, more aware of the space she was standing in. There was no immediate accusation, no attempt to reverse what had happened on stage, because at that point, there was nothing left to correct in the way they had always done before, and for a moment, the silence between us held everything that had changed, not just in the room, but over the years that had led to it. My father spoke first, not to defend, but to explain, his words measured, searching for something that could reconnect the present to the past, but the explanation didn't move the situation forward, because what he was trying to address had already been made clear, not through argument, but through what had been shown and confirmed. The check was still there. The offer still existed. $250,000, a share of something larger. Placed between us again, not as a demand this time, but as an option, something that could still be accepted if I chose to shift the direction of the moment. I looked at it briefly, not with consideration, but with recognition of what it represented. Not value. But a continuation of the same approach they had always used, replacing truth with something transactional, something that could be negotiated instead of acknowledged. Then I looked back at them. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to explain everything that had happened. I didn't need to revisit the past or list the ways it had shaped what I had become, because none of that would change what mattered in that moment. "I'm not here to destroy you," I said, my voice steady, not raised, not emotional, just clear enough to carry the weight of the decision behind it, and I let the words settle before continuing. "I'm here to stop your lies." There was no hesitation in it, no space for reinterpretation, because the meaning wasn't about what I was taking from them, it was about what I was refusing to participate in, and that distinction defined everything that followed. I didn't reach for the check, I didn't respond to the offer, because accepting it would have meant stepping back into the same structure I had already left behind, a system where truth could be adjusted, where identity could be negotiated, and where my place depended on what was useful to them. I wasn't going back. Not into their house, not into their narrative, not into a version of my life that had already been closed. And as I stepped away, leaving them standing in a space that no longer functioned the way they expected, the distance between us wasn't created in that moment. It had already existed, defined by years of decisions, and all I had done was recognize it clearly and choose not to cross it again. For a long time, I believed that power came from being accepted, from finding a way back into the spaces that had once rejected me, from proving that I was worth including in something I had been excluded from. But standing there at the end of everything, after the truth had been spoken, after the narrative they built had been stripped down to what it really was, I understood something that changed how I saw all of it. You don't become powerful by being accepted. You become powerful when you stop asking. They erased me, not in a single moment, but through a series of decisions that removed me piece by piece until there was nothing left of me in the version of their world they chose to show. And for years, I carried that absence like something that needed to be filled, something I had to correct or earn my way out of. But stepping away from that need didn't make me smaller. It made everything clearer. Nietzsche, because once I stopped asking to be seen by the people who refused to look, I started building something that didn't depend on them at all. So I became impossible to ignore. If you were in my position, would you take $250,000 to play a role in a story that was never true? Would you accept the money and step back into a version of your life that was built on something false? Or would you choose to expose the truth, even if it meant walking away from everything they offered? Would you choose the certainty of money or the clarity of truth? I want to know what you would do, because this isn't a simple choice. It reflects what matters more to you in the long run. So tell me, would you take the money or expose the truth? Comment yes if you would take the money, or no if you would expose the truth.